Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. I am Chaouki Abdallah, the Executive Vice President for Research at Georgia Tech, and I'm glad to welcome you to what I know will be a productive and insightful discussion around tech's approaches and partnerships with China. Before we get started, let me thank Dr. Jordan and Dr. Best for bringing us all together, as well as our special guests. Our new strategic plan at Georgia Tech makes clear that global engagement in tackling global challenges is core to our mission to develop leaders who advance technology and improve the human condition. By any measure, our global connection to China is one of our most significant. More Chinese students study at Tech than from any other country. Many Chinese scholars come to Tech as collaborators, and they stay as faculty. We have many joint collaborations with Chinese scholars and institutions in China. Our faculty includes sinologists and China scholars. And of course, we have our campus in Shenzhen. But let me be candid, we are increasingly aware of some of the negative aspects of US-China scientific technological collaborations in the news. Issues around intellectual property protections, transparency and conflicts of commitment, national security concerns, economic security concerns, our pledge to freedom of expression and inquiry, as well as our commitment to human rights and upholding human dignity. Our goal this morning is, while being mindful of these challenges, to productively examine ways to sustain valuable, profitable, and ethical collaborations. These global collaborations are among the ways we enhance diversity and ensure global excellence and leadership in scientific and technological progress. But global scientific collaborations, including the case of China, are also ways in which we engage in global science diplomacy. Today's speakers will help us examine the value of these collaborations, as they are instrumental to our pursuit of science and technological excellence, and also potentially serve other goals of science diplomacy. Science diplomacy scholars, including our two speakers this morning, will show us how global research collaborations can be used as a tool to improve bilateral relations and create and maintain contacts with citizens of a foreign state while addressing important shared technical problems. I am very pleased to introduce our first speaker this morning, Dr. Deborah Seligsohn. Dr. Seligsohn has been working China-US science diplomacy for decades, especially in the area of energy and environment. Deborah spent 20 years at the US Department of State, with her 4 final years serving as environment, science, technology, and health counselor at the US Embassy in Beijing. She left the Foreign Service in 2007, but remained in Beijing serving as principal advisor to the World Resources Institute's China Energy and Climate Program from 2007 to 2012. After all that time in the Foreign Service and civil society, she must have missed the university environment as she returned to school, pursuing her PhD from USC San Diego, where she wrote a dissertation on air pollution governance in China. After her graduation in 2018, she joined the Department of Political Science at Villanova University. She joins us this morning to speak on revitalizing the US-China science relationship in a new administration. Following Deborah's talk, we will move immediately to remarks from our own Dean, Kaye Husbands Fealing, who will examine broad issues of science collaboration and science diplomacy between China and the USA. Before becoming Dean of the Ivan Allen College of Liberal Arts, she served as chair of Tech School of Public Policy. Immediately following Dean Husbands Fealing's talk, we will transition to a question and answer period for both of our speakers. We will use the Q&A function on your toolbar, and so feel free to leave your questions in that area. Jenna will share additional details when the Q&A session begins. I'd like to thank you again for being here, and with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Dr. Seligsohn.
Good morning. Somehow the video keeps turning off. Seems like it's working now. I'm hoping that, here are my slides. Excellent. It's delightful to talk to all of you this morning, and I'm really honored by this invitation, and especially excited to talk to you about the science relationship, because I think it's so important, and it's really been a lifelong commitment of mine. And unfortunately, in the midst of trade wars and everything else, I think may have been somewhat neglected, especially in terms of the value that it gives to the U.S., to China, and to the world. So if I can have my next slide, please. You know, our relationship really goes back. I mean, I don't know. I studied history as an undergrad. It really goes back, you know, more than 100 years, right? That Chinese started coming to the U.S. to study science in the late 19th century. But there was a gap between 1949, when the Communist Party took over China, and 1972. And then in the 70s, we had lots of study tours and things like that back and forth, but it was pretty light. But I think the thing to realize is that the U.S.-China Science and Technology Umbrella Agreement was actually the first treaty signed between the U.S. and China after normalization of relations in 1979. For many decades, science cooperation has been seen as the ballast of the relationship. And I think that's an important thing to consider, especially now when science cooperation has come under so much scrutiny. There's a real history here. I think it's also important to think about what the situation was between the US and China, or what China was like back in 1979. And I wasn't in China in 1979. I first got to China in 1984. But, you know, we're talking about a period where competitive entrance to universities only restarted after the Cultural Revolution in 79. So by 84, we were seeing sort of the first crop of graduate students who'd actually been through a fully competitive undergraduate thing, rather than being chosen as farmer, worker, soldier students, which was not a period where they were choosing for academic excellence. There was virtually no equipment in any lab. We had electricity cut off 2 days a week. So even if you had equipment in your lab, you couldn't run it. You know, you had this long period from the early 60s until the beginning of the 80s, where people had really been cut off from developments in international science. And so they were starting basically from zero. People were also very poor. Even academics were spending most of their time just worrying about making sure that there was food on the table and things like that. There really was like little sort of basis there, and people were starting again from scratch. But there was enormous enthusiasm for development, a real belief in Deng Xiaoping, who's pictured there on the left, and his idea of the four modernizations, and that science and technology was a key to that and was going to help bring China forward. So if I can have the next slide, please. You know, US scientists were very interested in developing this relationship with China. And there were a lot of things that drove it. One of them was this quest for data. And I think, especially at the beginning, a lot of the reason people wanted to go there is because there are things that are in other places that you can't find. An awful lot of early scientists were, in fact, in the health field because you have to go where diseases are to find them, right? And even back that early, people understood that things like influenza were likely to arise in China. China also has a lot of dinosaurs, and a lot of the early missions were archaeological. There was also this big people-to-people drive. Starting in the early 70s, and when we started sending these groups back and forth, there was this idea that creating these civil society relationships was really important, and that a great way to do that was through science. Very rapidly, and so the graph on the right shows the growth in students. So I think it's worth noting that and I couldn't find a graph of just graduate students. So these are undergrads, but you'll notice, first of all, huge growth right from the beginning, but it just explodes after 2005. So there was a lot of interest, but it was still relatively modest. What people started to discover very rapidly is that there were lots of other advantages in China besides just unique pathogens or whatever. In medical science in particular, there was this advantage of these huge cohort studies that you could enroll 250,000 people in Harbin and get some real data on diabetes, for example. And one of the most important studies that US CDC ever did was this huge birth defect study where they enrolled 250,000 mothers and looked at impacts of diet on babies and figured out the whole thing about folic acid. So this idea that you could collect massive amounts of data in China, despite sort of all the rhetoric we hear about no data in China, starts way, way back in the 80s. The other thing, though, that we start to see right from the beginning is this idea that there are a lot of students that are going to be really useful for American labs, right? This starts in the mid 80s with the discovery of physicists from Hefei in Anhui province. You know, this is Fang Lizhi, who then became known as a dissident, but originally he was known as a professor who produced great students for American labs. And so started to be a huge interest in recruiting students from China, very much from the beginning, and obviously that has continued to be a big source of interest. So if I can have the next slide. The point I want to make about this is that this was a very unequal relationship. It was, Professor Xiaoyi Ming, who I've known for many years and is a China CDC researcher and was one of the first principal investigators from NIH in China, said earlier this year, in the beginning, you were the teacher and we were the student. And to paraphrase, that's not true anymore. And it really was a student-teacher relationship. There were all kinds of goals on the US side for doing that. A bunch of them were global. Let's teach the Chinese how to do environmental regulation and test air quality and water quality, because that's going to be good for the globe. An enormous amount of work done on nuclear non-proliferation between US DOE and Chinese counterparts, working with labs in China, the famous lab-to-lab cooperation, as it's known, between US national labs and their Chinese counterparts, protecting, as China started to build nuclear power plants, ensuring that those facilities had the security that they needed. Lots of work right from the beginning on disease prevention to ensure that diseases were detected and tracked, as sort of the US and China tended to work together under a WHO umbrella. So a lot of it, and I'm sure we could come up with a dozen other global interests as well. A lot of it was also this idea that working with Chinese counterparts would help to change China. And of course, this was the avowed goal of the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, right? Reform and modernization, reform and opening, right? So the idea was that opening would lead to some kinds of reform. So when you talk about things like changing China through cooperation, that wasn't necessarily considered a controversial idea, right? But American academics were definitely coming in with ideas like academic freedom, but also new ideas about how to do research, how to work together, a lot of interest in helping people improve their specific fields, improve educational quality, encouraging students to be scientists and investigators. and improve the quality of life. As I said, when we go back to the 80s, China was very poor, and a lot of scientific developments were actually improving people's the quality of delivery of agricultural produce, the quality of medicine, all these kinds of things. Huge interest from the US side in increasing research by increasing the volume of people doing research, creating research collaborations, but also, quite frankly, trolling for students, looking for as many students as people could get that would help enhance their laboratories. Just a quick stop in the next slide on the Cox report, which is the first time this really comes under condemnation. Wait, oh, I missed a slide. Sorry. Let's go back to, yeah. So I think I've already actually covered everything in this slide. Basically, that, you know, we see these changes really happen. That there's just a dramatic increase in research and education in China. The academic atmosphere is orders of magnitude more open than it was 30 years ago. As you all know so well, Chinese scholars now engage with the world everywhere. You cannot go to an academic conference without there being a huge contingent from great Chinese universities, and Chinese universities now host great conferences. This research really leads to results that everybody uses. It's increased safety in all kinds of areas. And of course, there are lots and lots of great grad students and professors in the US that were, have been generated through this cooperation. Next slide. So then we get to the first time this really comes under criticism. And I suppose there are probably a few professors here who may remember this, but for everybody else, this is probably ancient history, but I wrote the wrong date on the slide. I apologize. That should say 1998, not 88. I obviously had a bit of an error when I typed it. Sorry about that. In 1998, this congressional report comes out called the Cox Report that accuses China of stealing nuclear secrets. It's an extremely broad report that has data of massively varying quality, from clear data to stuff that really is just allegations with no evidence. The implications are way overdrawn, and it conflated private business, academic research, and US government into conclusions that made it sound like the Chinese government had stolen from US government science, which actually is nowhere in the Cox report. And also accusing academic science, most of the stuff that, so if there's stuff stolen, most of it was stolen from private business. It also was the case, and there were actually legal proceedings taken. Some of the information that was given to Chinese partners was given by private businesses, but it was illegally given to them. They should not have received it. That's a violation by the US business involved, and they were prosecuted for that. But in the Cox report, it kind of gets then tarred on the whole US government and academic science. And as I say, the implications were very broad, and it seemed like it was going to create this very negative period for US-China science cooperation. Next slide, please. But that was 1998, and 2001 changes everything. And so that negative period in US-China science relations actually wound up being very short. So in 9/11 really increased the value on the Chinese relationship. I mean, one view of American politics in this period is that the US was looking for a new enemy. And at the end of the 90s, some people thought it was going to be China. And then with 9/11, it became terrorism. right? So, and that has implications for what's going on right now in terms of how many in Washington are looking at China, right? That the Cold War was this way of framing relations with the world, and that there's a certain number of people who want to constantly frame the world in terms of one big battle, right? But 9/11 increased the value of the relationship in very practical ways. China was helpful in terms of the U.S. efforts in Afghanistan. It was supportive in terms of certain UN resolutions in the early days. It became more important to maintain a good relationship with China, which, after all, borders on Afghanistan and some of the other areas that are of major concern to the United States. You also had President George W. Bush come in, who was really committed to the U.S.-China legacy. I think, as a lot of people know, his father headed the liaison office in the early 70s and was very committed to it. George W. Bush famously had traveled almost nowhere in the world before becoming president, but one of the places he actually had traveled was to China. And he also was really interested in science. If you look back at the things he said, for example, about emerging infections after SARS, they're really smart. And if people in this current administration had bothered to look at them, we might all be in a much better place than we are. And he actually got very interested in promoting the U.S.-China health relationship after SARS. He was also interested in other things like space cooperation and personally got involved in that. So you had a government that from the top was very interested in promoting the science relationship. And it really did lead to a peak in this relationship that I would describe as somewhat paternalistic, though. It's very much the idea of, we Americans are going to go and teach you Chinese a whole bunch of stuff. So we get this massive, massive increase in health cooperation. Our CDC operation in Beijing grows from basically 2 or 3 experts that we had over there to a big operation by the end, I think about 10 experts from Atlanta with like 50 staff. We also, for the first time, actually had a health attaché directly from HHS to sort of oversee it. We very early on after SARS brought in an NIH rep, and then later, with a bunch of problems that the Chinese were having with food safety in particular, we brought in a FDA rep as well. So there was a big idea, NIH was doing these early grants that were to train up researchers to be able to get them to the level of being able to apply for their own R1 grants. So it was really an idea of, we're going to work with people, we're going to train them up, and we're going to help them get to this very advanced stage. This is also the time when the Chinese became part of the Human Genome Project. So you have all kinds of stuff going on. National Science Foundation opened an office in Beijing then. NSF does not have a huge number of offices overseas, so this was a big deal for them. Department of Energy opened an office in Beijing that pursued energy cooperation, lots and lots of stuff on nuclear safety, nuclear security, clean energy, fossil fuels, clean coal, how to transform the Chinese energy system. So we had a lot of stuff going on, and other agencies of the U.S. government that were not, present with long-term offices in Beijing, like the Environmental Protection Agency, also had flourishing cooperation during these years, as well as NOAA and groups like that. So it was really a period of massive growth in the relation. Can I have the next slide, please? And I think this continued. So a lot of the cooperation continued after 2008, and there was really robust cooperation through 2016. But I do think that the changes that started to happen really did start to happen after 2008. So, I think we, in the midst of this COVID disaster, have lost track of how huge a blow the global financial crisis was. And I think it was a loss of confidence in the US, certainly among the public, as to the ability of government to deliver. But it was also an enormous increase in confidence in China, because no country did better in responding to the global financial crisis than China. The Chinese actually poured the trillions of dollars in stimulus that were needed to really revive the economy quickly in a way that the United States did not. And many Chinese, especially in government, came away feeling, we shouldn't be the student anymore. We actually can figure things out. We know how to do this. I used to, when I worked for the World Resources Institute, go every year to the organization called the China Development Forum, which was a group run by the China, this think tank under the State Council, which is essentially the cabinet of China, called the Development Research Council. So it was like the group that directly advises the premier and the vice premiers. And every year they have this big economic forum. They invite essentially Nobel Prize economists and CEOs from around the world that pay a lot of money to attend, basically. But it's this big discussion. And until 2008, the basic tenor was these fancy economists would fly in and tell the Chinese what they ought to do. And after 2008, Chinese economists started pushing back and saying, look, we have ideas about how to run our own economy, and we think we might know how to do this because, look, we're doing fine. And I think you start to see that in field after field, that people are feeling like, hey, we can actually do this, and we're no longer in this student-teacher relationship, but you're assuming that we are. At the same time, there are other things going on. One of the big ones is it starts to be when the bite of China's WTO entry in terms of its impact on manufacturing in the United States really starts to hit. And this really wasn't documented well until a paper by O'Toole, Dorn, and Hansen in 2013 that went back and looked at when this happened. Because the assumption was more free trade is good, right? It increases the pie, which is absolutely true, but it also changes the way it's sliced. And economists tend to say, well, as long as you compensate the losers, that'll be fine. But what O'Toole, Dorn, and Hansen show is the losers were never compensated. And there's been a whole bunch of work since then, including some I've been involved in, where we've shown that the political implications of that are pretty strong in the United States. That is one that you can actually connect the negative impacts of WTO entry on specific areas of the United States, on changes in their politics, and in particular in the increasing hostility of the Republican Party to China. So at the same time you see the impacts in China, that China is becoming much, much wealthier, especially in the coasts and in the cities. And you saw that graph I showed you where student population in the United States just balloons after 2005. And that's because of wealthy parents. Those are the people who are paying tuitions for your undergrad, right? And so it's just a dramatic change in both countries. At the same time, we also have another change, which is in 2012, President Xi Jinping comes into power. And that really does change the tenor of governance in China. that China is both more assertive, but it's also more controlling, that it wasn't a return to 1978 or 1983, but it definitely is an area where people are more scrutinized, where the internet is more controlled, where there's a lot more government presence than there had been for a while. So at the same time, Chinese scientific capacity is rapidly increasing, and especially in the United States, where we have President Trump then come to power in 2017 with sort of America First, with with the big trade war accusations. The changes in science capacity in China get viewed mainly through the lens of security. A lot of the conversation is about cyber, even though the capacity improvements are across the board in many, many fields. And at the same time, the US legal stance changes so that company security gets mixed up with national security in ways that I don't think are useful, right? So intellectual property rights violations start to be treated as criminal matters when they were previously viewed as civil matters. Companies that may be doing things, like developing seeds, that didn't used to be viewed as a national security issue. That used to be viewed as a commercial security issue. And so we get this real expansion of what is viewed as national security within science and technology, and especially on the applied side. And at the same time, under the Trump administration, you start to see this huge drop down in the amount of government scientific capacity of the US government in China. So most of the CDC gets brought home. I think this had a lot to do with the budget cuts at the CDC, and just, when they had to prioritize, they have to make sure they're providing aid to the states before they can run their international offices. Because on the office that probably was the worst to cut back for what then happened with COVID, their global disease detection operation, they cut back most of their offices around the world. But we had a bunch of other cooperative programs with China. Most of them got cut back. With an HIV/AIDS program that was already planned to be cut back, that made total sense. But because the Chinese have actually done a really good job, and again, in moving from student to teacher, they were ready to just move on their own. But on a lot of these other areas, it really cut off our eyes and ears. We closed our NSF office, which I think was also a funding issue. There just is a huge problem with, we didn't even have the capacity to really understand what was going on because we cut back so much. So if I could have the next slide, please. So I think COVID-19 really illustrates this gulf that was developing between the US and China. So, and it also illustrates the goodwill that's still there, that we could get this back. So first of all, the Chinese CDC called the US CDC right at the beginning of the problem. The first phone call, and I apologize for the ambulance going by, was either December 31st or January 1st. It was way at the beginning that George Gao called Redfield to discuss it. And US CDC offered assistance, but they offered the completely wrong assistance to the Chinese. On January 6th, Robert Redfield sends a letter to George Gao offering to help the Chinese sequence the COVID-19 genome. The Chinese published the COVID-19 genome on January 10th. They didn't need any help in how to sequence this genome. And given the fact that we knew that they had developed the this huge capacity, starting with the help we'd given them under the Human Genome Project. This shouldn't have been a surprise. So we offered them assistance, but we didn't offer them what they needed. And then we had this weird thing where our president was at first saying, oh, everything's fine, and then starting to make just really xenophobic and nastily racist accusations against the Chinese. And a real lack of understanding everywhere, not just with our government, but in the media, and I would say even with the majority of China scholars, of what was going on in China, right? That, you know, in my estimation, there was about a 1 week cover up in the middle of January, maybe 2 weeks. Prior to that, I think what you had was a huge fight over whether this was something new or not. As we see the fact that there were cases in the US as early as December and none of our doctors noticed that they were dealing with a new pathogen, I think it becomes more and more understandable that the Chinese were flummoxed, confused, and different doctors had different opinions. But a cover-up in January does not mean that they failed to control it in March. And when there was this huge suffering in Wuhan and in Hubei province, and you had 70 million people under lockdown and just massive suffering and just no compassion coming from the US government, the US media. We did this crazy thing where we evacuated our diplomats before we evacuated our citizens from Wuhan, so that there was nobody to help our citizens leave the city. And that was left to, you know, overburdened Chinese officials to deal with. There just were huge, huge problems where it didn't seem like we cared or were really helping in any real way. And at the same time, we weren't listening to the Chinese in any real way about what this disease was really about. We didn't look at what they had to do to control this virus, and we never did it ourselves, as we now know, right? You know, in the end, the Chinese have recorded 100,000 cases, almost 100,000. They're up to 97,000 something. In general, in the United States, we think we have 5 times as many cases as the number we record, and the Chinese probably are in the same boat. I mean, with the large number of asymptomatic cases and mild cases, you don't catch everybody. But we're up to 400,000 deaths. We have 4 times as many deaths as they have cases. There was an enormous amount of expertise there, and we were not looking to China for expertise. We were mostly looking to be accusatory, frankly. And I think that has really shown a gap in understanding that's going to be very difficult. But what we need to do is move forward. And that's my next slide. So I think we need to recognize that this student-teacher model is dead, and we really need to make sure we put it in the grave, that we need scientists to work with each other as peers, and we need to respect the fact that Chinese institutions are now well developed. Obviously, it's not the case that in every area their Chinese expertise is equally strong, and I haven't been tracking every area of science. When I headed the science section in Beijing, we had different people looking at different areas, and I remember back at the time, which is now 15 years ago, you know, people said on nanotechnology, they're really good on this part, but not so good on that part. So of course it's not going to be equally strong in every area, but it's really important to make sure you re-examine your priors and think about where the strengths are and don't assume that they're not there. As I said, one of the really good examples of this was not thinking about the fact that, hey, they have great sequencing on the genome, but gee, we really should be cooperating on getting vaccine development done quickly. That's obviously an area where the US has been even faster than the Chinese. The Chinese are using some pretty traditional technologies, which honestly, if they can work, would be great because they don't require this incredible refrigeration. So we really should be working with them to help them get those vaccines better, frankly. But we should be thinking about, where do we have the strengths? Where do they have the strengths? How do we work with a peer? Just like we don't assume that scientists in the UK are going to be up at the same level as as some university in the US on everything. That doesn't mean we don't treat them as peers, and we absolutely have to treat them as peers. The assumptions were really damaging, right? I mean, there was this assumption that the reason the Chinese were having so much trouble on COVID was because somehow their hospitals were incompetent. In fact, their hospitals had more different types of breathing equipment than we did. They also turned out to have way more access to PCR machines for testing than we did. And the problem with controlling this disease turned out to be it's really hard to control. And so it's really important that we be understanding the capacity that's there, both because it's going to lead to better opportunities for collaboration, but also because I think this last year has shown when we fail to do so, we don't prepare ourselves properly for risks that we face in the future. And can I have my next slide, please? But the other thing I wanted to address is that it's time to me to address the security issue. And I don't mean simply saying, yes, 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 FBI, everything you're worried about is correct, because I think there's a lot of evidence that that's not true. And it means that universities have to speak up for their scientists and for their equities. And it doesn't mean that everything is untrue either, but it does mean that things have to be dealt with in a more balanced way, and that an accusation is not the same as proof. And I think we have a bunch of different issues. As I mentioned, I think the US government has conflated industrial security with national security, and they aren't the same. So I think it's important to keep things in proportion. We also have already demonstrated a number of cases where Chinese scientists have been falsely accused. There's a history of this going back to the 1950s that was recently documented in a book called The Scientist and the Spy. But it continues to be a problem. So there may be scientists who are doing things that are nefarious, but assuming that everybody's doing something in bad faith, I think, is a real problem. And assuming that every accusation is going to pan out simply destroys people's careers. There are a lot of sloppy behaviors that people are being accused that are pretty widespread, but are now becoming an issue if it involves China, right? Double dipping on grants, frankly, is more common than it should be. So it's important to keep perspective. The other thing is, there's a reason why there's kind of double dipping on grants, right? People use one grant to produce the preliminary results to prove that they can do the next grant, but that isn't what that grant was actually for. So people use justifications for money for things maybe they've already done because they have to show so much. There's all kinds of crazy paperwork things. We have to be more careful about that to protect ourselves. Universities have to be working with their scientists to make sure that they aren't cutting corners and that they have the capacities they need to get this paperwork right so they don't run into trouble. But what we've seen over and over again is implications that something more nefarious is happening when all that's been shown is double dipping on grants. And sometimes that might be because there's something more there and they just can't actually prove it. But I think sometimes it's because there's nothing else there but double dipping on grants. So we really need to be thinking about how to protect our scientists, how to make sure that their paperwork is super in order. And we need to be pushing back on the idea that every scientist is a security risk, because I think they aren't. And as principal investigators, as leaders of labs, you need to be working with your grad students closely enough and well enough so that if they run into trouble, you can stand up for them, that you know their work and you know what they're doing. So I think there's a real need for a greater commitment at the university level to the members of the university community. And we need to be educating our elected representatives about the benefits of our collaborative work. So I gather from a physicist friend of mine that they have an annual door knock that they go to Washington and talk to their elected representatives about the benefits of physics. You're working with Chinese scientists. You need to tell them how that's actually helping your physics work. Don't just talk about physics in general. Talk about the fact that your Chinese grad students are great. Talk about the fact that you actually are doing work that has nothing to do with national security, because most basic science doesn't. That is going to be really interesting and involves Wuhan University or Zhejiang University or whatever. We need to actually stand up for this. This is a lesson that the business community learned in the early 90s, right? After Tiananmen, China actually started to open up again. It was, you know, there actually was increased freedom in the early 90s, and yet the U.S. was still sort of in sanctions mode. And so the American business community started going to Washington every spring to talk to Congress people about what the benefits of the relationship were and the benefits of the business. If scientific cooperation matters to you, you have to stand up and you have to actually ensure that your professors and your students are being protected. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the conversation.
Good morning. I'm Kaye Husbands Feeling and Dean of Auburn Allen College of Liberal Arts, and I'm so excited about this workshop today. And Dr. Seligsohn's remarks were just spectacular, and I know that there will be many, many questions and engagement during our time today together. Hopefully you can hear me well and I'm communicating well, and I just want to go through a brief discussion on science diplomacy in China. And much of what I'm going to talk about is based on some engagements that I've had. One was in China in a U.S.-China dialogue on how to establish protocols for funding science. That was one which it initially occurred in San Diego several years ago, and then we also had that engagement in Beijing. And there was a lot of exploration of how to do scientific research and fund scientific research. But more so, my remarks will revolve around two other studies. One, an American Academies study titled American and the International Future of Science, America and the International Future of Science, which just was released a couple of months ago, and I was on the working group for that. And then another report by the Royal Society where we met a few years ago in 2017 to discuss the new frontiers in science diplomacy, navigating the changing balance of power. And that was, again, more broadly about science diplomacy, but I want to turn attention specifically throughout my remarks to China. Next slide, please. You'll see from this diagram that exactly what Dr. Seligsohn said just a few minutes ago, how important it is for scientific engagement across all nations, including China. And she gave explicit remarks about what that meant in terms of the new coronavirus and developing the genomic information for that. And of course, supply chains are important here. But we don't want to go back to a time when we see this kind of vaccine nationalism or the borders come up around science so that engagement is limited. So that's going to be the tenor of my remarks today. This diagram is from April 7, 2020, but it's an illustration of how important it is to have this scientific engagement across countries, again, including China. So I'd like to be able to, next slide, please, just briefly mention what I have in my mind when I think about science diplomacy. This is from a report, again, the Royal Society, but their 2010 report, New Frontiers in Science Diplomacy. So what we did in 2017 was a continuation of that dialogue. And there are three different ways of looking at this. Science in diplomacy, basically informing foreign policy objectives with scientific advice and evidence. Another is diplomacy for science, facilitating international science cooperation. I'll talk a lot about that toward the end of my remarks. And the third is using science cooperation to improve international relations between countries. And I'm sure not only in this segment, but later on today, that will be at the forefront of our discussion. Next slide, please. So the critical question that comes up often, how do we get a clear-sighted view of China that does not underestimate, nor does it overestimate the risks and allow us to develop a strategy without potentially disastrous historical consequences? I think that question frames up the balance, next slide please, that we typically are trying to work through. We understand the benefits of collaborative science, but we also know that there are some risks involved that we need to mitigate, and there are ways of doing that that we can talk about in a few minutes. This slide is a little busy, but I really want to walk through a few things that are really important to lay as a foundation here. For China, we see significant science and technology capacity, increasing connections to the U.S. S&T activities. One example, only one example, in 2018 data, you see approximately 10% of all U.S. science and engineering articles had Chinese collaborators. That's just an indicator. That's just one way of looking at the slice of how engaged we are collaboratively with China in science and engineering. Also, China is a formidable competitor in their economy, in the economic strength, and the connections that we have between our economies. So it's not just their prowess, but also the connectivity of our economies is also incredibly important to remember here. And increasingly assertive foreign policy in China, also in the United States, and consolidation of power in China. Those are those are some of the background and frameworks that we have here. But we also need to know, here are some of the things that make it so important for us to continue these collaborations over time. Pressing scientific challenges do not stop at national borders. And for those on this call, I'm sure you know that that is an initial premise. There are scientific and broad economic benefits from international scientific collaboration. Some are super additive. Some are certainly much more than if we were to, again, go back to isolation within our science, also within our economies. Scientific talent is emerging globally at an increasing rate. Another example here, you can go from the low thousands, say in 1996, to about 55,000 in 2018, looking again at measuring scientific collaboration and the incidence of co-authorship with scientists internationally. that's broadly international. The U.S. scientific advantages benefit from global collaboration of scientific communities. And I know I've said that more than once, but I want to make the point here that it's not just about our economic benefit, but it's also about scientific advancement. Dr. Seligsohn mentioned these very items in her remarks. Collaboration to find advances, to find cures, or at least inoculations against infectious diseases, issues related to climate change and air and water pollution. Material science is also an area where quite a bit of engagement internationally and also specifically with China. Quantum computing and quantum information is also one of those areas. So we are making advances in these areas as a nation, but we do it collaboratively internationally, and that is a major point here. Universities need to craft and balance and have a balanced approach that is constantly reassessed. So that is that balance we talked about. We don't want to close up our borders, but we also need to make sure that we have assessments in place. And I can speak to that later on about some of the things that are done at various universities. Next slide, please. Just to punctuate what I just said here, it's important for us to look at our international students and embrace that collaboration that comes with the students that are at our universities. The U.S. needs to continue that work with our students and celebrate the fact that that ingenuity comes across and flows across borders. And we also need to make sure that we're looking at fundamental research and the ways in which fundamental research benefits from those types of collaborations. Next slide, please. So students are the key. And if you look at science, health, and engineering, if you look at those specific areas of specific fields, international students broadly now represent about a third of the graduate students, and that's a figure from 2017. Mainly from China, India, and South Korea, and about a third of that international share comes from China. Again, an important part of our collaborative environment in science and huge contributions from students around the world, including from China, in our scientific advancement here in the United States. The figure at the bottom that I want to draw your attention to indicates the percent of doctoral recipients who intend to stay in the United States once they complete their degree. And between 2013 and 19, you see that figure for Asia, which is that top line. If you can't see it very clearly, you can see that top line. And that is between 75 and 80%. So it isn't that they're necessarily going back to another country, but want to also be here and contribute to the scientific activity and engineering activity here in the United States. Next slide, please. So I'm going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. I wanted to make the point, again, back to the definition of science diplomacy and the different ways of looking at it. The diplomacy from science, this is an article in that report that I mentioned by the American Academies. The leaders of the U.S. scientific community in various fields, including professional societies, should engage their Chinese colleagues to discuss universally agreed norms, ethical obligations, and standard practices. Now, I put here as an example something that's on the American Physical Society's China and APS page. Interestingly, as part of an ongoing effort to better serve the global physics community, APS, American Physical Society, has dedicated resources to further its international engagement activities, learn more about APS programs, events, publications, and so on, to the physics community in China. So that bridge that is so important here. Next slide, please. But with that bridge, we need to make sure that we understand too that science can be used to inform our diplomacy. The evidentiary science, and including social science, is incredibly useful in terms of determining how our diplomacy works, our political science, and economic science and sociological, all this, especially in the social sciences, we'll see that evidence. Please click through. And also we know that we have science can contribute to foreign policy objectives and to improving relations. And furthermore, next point, that we also see that scientific collaboration can create trust, and that trust is so important as a bridge within our society, our scientific activities. Please, the next slide. Just a couple more things that I want to point out. This slide is a little busy. It has the partner on the next slide, but what it basically points out is this. If we're looking at ways of engagement, there are different ways in which we can engage in large scale. This is from the Large Scale Science Report. And so everything is not a one-size-fits-all means of engagement. And this is from Gary Sanders. He's a professor at Caltech, and he actually runs observatories. So many of these examples are observatories, but some, everyone knows CERN. But look at the point here is that we could have treaties and partnerships, collaborations. Next slide, please. As well as different types of collaborations that some are binding, some are not so binding, all the way to the least, bullet 7, the least strong, which is non-coordinated, separate, but related existing activities. The point here is that scientific engagement and collaboration is important for informing and advancing science, but and also for advancing diplomacy. But there are different levels in which this engagement can be seen. Please go to the next slide. So I just want to thank you for listening and just finish up with this one statement that is one of the crucial findings when Artie Bienstock and Peter Mickelson were in the working group, finishing up this project. They really did want to punctuate with this conclusion. The United States cannot afford to ignore China's emergence as a leading investor with an impressive national research enterprise. It is vital that the United States not be caught by surprise by a major advance made in China. If the United States puts up curtains, China will as well. Now, I wanted to end with that statement on my slide, but let's just, in Truth in Advertising, the next statement is that U.S. intelligence community has indicated that there are some collaborations that are going to be observed and that protocols are in place at universities and other scientific institutions to ensure that all protocols are followed for all international collaborations. So thank you very much, and I turn it back to Jenna, or shall we?
All right. Can everybody see me? Okay, hello. I think we're all up on the screen. Terrific. Well, thank you both, Dr. Seligsohn and Dean Husbands Fealing, for those really terrific remarks. It was so interesting. We have quite a few questions in both the Q&A and the chat function. So please feel free to put your question into either place, and I will monitor that. We only have about 11 minutes left, so we won't have time for everyone's questions, but thank you all for participating. So we actually had two questions, and I'm going to pose it to both of you, Dr. Seligsohn and Dr. Husbands Fealing, and I'm going to kind of link a couple questions together. But there was a few different questions about how we distinguish international security, industrial security, and national security concerns, given how everything is so intertwined these days. So, for example, should we see the Huawei 5G issues as industrial security? There was another question that was looking at, that was maybe perhaps, questioning whether or not, sort of national security secrets had been stolen in order to create, military technology and things like that. So I just wanted to pose that question as an initial one.
So I do think it's difficult, but I do think it has to be done. And I mean, one good way to think about it is it actually promoting military technology? So I think that's a starting point. That's obviously an issue. But I think, and I really am not an expert in the whole Huawei thing. I don't want to delve into that. But what I do think is it's quite clear that there are things on the fringes that are clearly not national security that have been sucked into this. And part of this is because simple intellectual property theft that used to be dealt with through civil action became criminalized sometime in the last 20 years. The law actually changed. And in doing that, it brought the FBI into things like the stealing seed strains. No, you shouldn't steal seed strains, but it used to be something that companies had to deal with, not the government. And so I do think we need to figure out which things, maybe the companies need government help. That still doesn't make it national security. It just makes it theft, right? And so I think it's important to go through and think about areas and think about how to manage these issues, but also not to conflate things that are clearly not national security, like using grant funds for different things, which people have done this for years. So we need to be more careful about that. Universities should help professors with that. But we also need to push back on the idea that everything is a national security problem.
Not much more to add to that, aside from just to say, I mean, completely agree. And protocols need to be in place in order to be able to detect when something is going on. And that protocol is also dependent on the US scientists doing the reporting that's necessary within the structure that's set up. And so it's something that it could be detected, and I know I've seen some, I could probably send it to you later, different methods of putting these detection protocols in place at universities. But the, teaching and making sure that, course curriculum, engaging our students and all of that should be outside of that part of the debate. And also it's really important to understand what, discovery science is really purely discovery science. And the industrial part is downstream and the discovery part is upstream. And, we're not going to put on blinders here, but there should be a way of really putting those detectors in place downstream, making sure everyone's doing proper reporting. But upstream, we need to collaborate and science needs to advance.
All right, thank you. I actually received a question via email from General Breedlove. So this question is for Dr. Seligsohn, and so I'm going to read his question. He says, thank you for your presentation. You strongly assert that we have incorrectly conflated company security with national security. You used as example seeds and double dipping on grants. These have not come to my attention. What concerns me is the terabytes of data China has exfilled from our companies on stealth tech, radar tech, communications links, and non-intercept techniques, among many others. Our companies do this research, and China is prolific in its attack on their security systems and data storage. So, ma'am, respectfully, I disagree with you. We have to do much more to protect our companies from these relentless attacks.
Well, I think we need to do more to protect our companies from all relentless attacks, right? I mean, every 6 months I get an email telling me that my data has been stolen, right? And, it's gotten to the point where annually I have to replace my credit card because it's been stolen. And I'm serious, it's been every year lately. So I think we need to do this to protect the American people, and the people stealing it are not just in China. I also would point out that China is this broad thing that includes everything from the Chinese government to nefarious private actors, just like the United States includes government companies and private criminals, right? So there's a huge need for better cybersecurity, and I think it is incumbent on the U.S. government to both work with companies, but also hold companies responsible for protecting their data, right? There's been a tendency of companies to ignore data breaches, to not publicize data breaches. That's changed a bit since the Equifax hack. I think this issue is much larger than China, actually. and that singling out China in some ways gets companies off the hook from their irresponsible cybersecurity protections.
Thank you. Our next question is from Dr. Kozel from the School of International Affairs, my colleague. She says, thank you for the presentation, much appreciated, especially regarding the CDC's international engagement efforts. Would you speak to any observations or thoughts you have on the suggestions that COVID-19 resulted from a lab spillover accident in Wuhan, not the technical veracity, but the geopolitics?
So in terms of the technical veracity, I think the best paper is the Anderson et al. Nature paper from March, which suggests while it's a possibility, it's the least likely of the three scenarios that they run through, which include that it arose in Wuhan and include the distinct possibility that it arose somewhere else and that Wuhan was simply the first city where it amplified. The Chinese system is particularly well suited both to amplifying disease in a hospital setting and to catching the disease when it's amplified, because Chinese people go to the hospital for everything. While we tend to go to private doctors' offices, they've tried now for 2 decades to get people to go to clinics rather than to the hospital when they have a cold. And they've been unable because people think the doctors at hospitals are better trained. They may well be right. But therefore, when you have a new disease, it tends to get into a hospital. These kinds of diseases like SARS and COVID that amplify in hospitals tend to spread very quickly. So that clearly is what happened in Wuhan. But because it spreads quickly and because it's in a hospital and you have lots of doctors, they talk to each other, and so they also catch it. Because we now have evidence that it was in the US as early as December, maybe even November, and doctors in the US did not catch it. Look at the mess in New Rochelle, New York that started when? End of February, beginning of March? I mean, it was already all over New York City, and we have great doctors in New York City, and not a single one of them was reporting a case of SARS, right? I mean, COVID, sorry, wrong disease. So I think we have to realize that there are a lot of reasons why this thing moved around very quickly and why it was found in Wuhan, and we really have no idea where it came from. I think the geopolitical implications of the really rabid accusations against China are to make people in China defensive, right? I think it's hurt a lot of people. I mean, I did a lot of interviews myself with public health people over the summer that I know in China, and people felt personally hurt. These are people who have worked collaboratively with Americans for decades. Most of them actually have part of their training in the United States, and they just feel like they were betrayed by a country that they partnered with for so many years. I mean, and, you know, there are more Apprentice fans in China than anywhere in the world because there's always more of everything. And so I think people actually felt betrayed by the president as well. And so I think it's been really bad. We have no evidence that it was a lab leak. The woman who did all the work said she went through all her samples to check. The guy who worked with her, Dr. Peter Daszak, doesn't think it was. And in the midst of this whole thing, what do? The U.S. government cuts off Dr. Daszak's funding to continue to do coronavirus research with China. This is not the last coronavirus we're going to deal with. And we've decided, basically cut off our nose to spite our face. So it's not good. I'm hoping that resuming relations with the WHO and starting to work again will start to move things in the right direction.
Well, I am so disappointed that we are out of time because we have some really terrific questions in the Q&A about human rights issues. We have another great question by Charles Burgess about ways in which we can move forward to develop and demonstrate trust and respect for each other, which I think I was wanting to hear more from Dr. Husbands Fealing, her talk about ways in which we can move forward in these relationships So hopefully these are conversations that we will all continue. And thank you all for attending today. I appreciate your being here and taking the time. And most of all, I'd like to thank our speakers. Thank you for being here and lending your expertise to such important issues right now. So hope everyone has a wonderful day and a great semester, and all the best.
Thank you so much. Bye. Have a good weekend.